to this second sort of web series with the New Zealand Coastal Society. So today we have two speakers, and the first one will be Anita Lewis, and Anita is a research master's student in ecology and biodiversity, and she's looking at microplastic pollution in the Tauranga Harbour and on the East Coast. She was first introduced to the topic of microplastic pollution when she worked as an intern at Scion at the end of 2018, and she's put out a publication with one of her colleagues at Scion on the microplastic pollution of beach sediment in and around Auckland. She received a Tech scholarship to undertake her master's research, and she's passionate about this subject and is looking at the impacts of microplastic pollution on the economy, communities and cultural significance of kai moana within the Bay of Plenty area. Our second speaker is Laura Robichaud, and Laura is a PhD student in environmental science at the University of Auckland, and she is working within and funded by the New Zealand Living at the Edge Resilience Challenge program. Her research focuses on the social, financial and institutional factors resulting in the implementation gap of coastal risk management projects. She uses her experience of growing up in Louisiana and experiencing coastal hazards and attending community meetings, and her training in coastal engineering to provide a practical lens on the principles discussed in the academic literature. She's anticipating to publish soon, but I know she's been saying that for a while now. So anyway, if you have some questions, feel free to write them down. If you could please list the author that you have the question for, and then we can get to those at the end. With that in mind, I'll hand it over to Anita in the first instance, and then she will then pass it on to Laura after that. Okay, thanks.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. In this presentation, I will give a brief overview of what microplastic particles are. Sorry, I just want to get my PowerPoint up for you guys. There we go. I will then discuss the research I've conducted in Tauranga Moana and the eastern coastline. Lastly, I will discuss why I care about this issue and why everyone else should care. So what are microplastic particles? Microplastic particles are particles smaller than 5 millimeter in diameter. They are grouped into two main classes: primary microplastics and secondary microplastics. Primary microplastic particles such as noodles and microbeads are particles that are 5 millimeter or smaller at the time of entering the environment. Secondary microplastic particles such as plastic cups, bottles and bags enter the environment as macroplastics, and then through degradation such as UV radiation and weathering breaks down into microplastic particles. Microplastic particles are further grouped into three types: fibers, fragments and films. Fibers are synthetic textiles from clothing, for example nylon. Paint shavings can be classed as films, and then other plastic bits are fragments. Microplastic particles enter the environment predominantly through urban wastewater, stormwater, and industrial drainage systems. Wastewater treatment plants catch macroplastics only. And as you guys can see in this little diagram, it's a study conducted by Infrin and colleagues in 2019 that wastewater enters into a wastewater treatment plant, but then through abrasion, the microplastics are actually being outputted as nanoplastics, and nanoplastics is 1 micron or smaller. and that is actually being outputted in the treated water, which then is drinkable water, river effluent, or reusable water. So it is really a massive problem. So this brings me to my study that was focused on Tauranga Harbour and 2 locations on the eastern coastline, Mount Maunganui Main Beach and the Omanu sewage outfall. I sampled sediment core samples as well as 2 bivalve species, Ostrovenus tuchbarahi and Macamona liliana. The 2 species was chosen based on their feeding modes in the marine environment. I have hypothesized that Macamona, being a deposit feeder, will ingest more microplastic particles than Ostrovenus, which is a filter feeder, due to the residence time of microplastic particles in the water column before they bioaccumulate in the sediments. These were the sampling locations that was randomly selected. I do apologize for the quality of this map. I've only saw after the PowerPoint went up that it's a bit faint. We can get a general idea. So due to time constraints, all of the harbour could not have been sampled last summer. So there is a big sampling gap here, just south of Ongari Point and north of Pahoja. But this will be addressed for an ongoing summer project with the Bay of Plenty Regional Council. So watch this space for an update. And more open coast locations will also be selected, like the outer bar of Matakana Island, where we'll sample further down to Bowen Town and Waihi Beach, and as far up north as possibly as Podeke. But for now, we just have those 2 open coast locations, Mount Maunganui and Omanu. So this is the basic sampling grid and quadrat that I've used. So I need you guys to just use a bit of imagination here and envision those blue dashes as being the ocean. Within this 0.5 by 0.5 meter quadrat here, 5 core samples were collected of the sediment and with a stainless steel core. So we take a lot of precaution with quality control and quality assurance to make sure that there's no contamination getting into our samples. So those cores are 6 centimeter in diameter and 5 centimeter deep. And how we have sampled is we take 3 samples on the intertidal mark and then 3 on the high tide mark with at least a 30 meter distance between each sampling point, depending on the size of the beach of the estuary. So we have to always sometimes adjust. Sometimes we can go bigger as 50 meters apart if the size allow, or we can go like 20 meters. But to make it really substantial, we try not to go smaller than 20 meters, just to get a good cover of the whole area. So the laboratory processing of sediment samples is quite tedious and time consuming. So what we do first is a density separation of the sediment. So we need to float the microplastic particles away from the sediment. And how we do that is we use saturated solution, a 5 millimole density of sodium chloride. So the rationale behind this is that the less dense light microplastic particles will float out from the sediment. Then we put it through a rigorous chemical process, the wet peroxidation process, where we use iron sulfate and a 30% hydrogen peroxide solution. That removes all the organics from our solution, and we hope that we just have the microplastics left behind. So then it goes through a further density separation with more Merck salts being added to create another density difference, and that is like per the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Protocol. If you guys want more information on the chemical processing, I'm happy to share that after this presentation, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. And then we do analyze it with a stereo microscope, and we do quantification and classification of the particles. So I do measure the size, I do look whether I found fibrous forms or fragments. And to make sure that we are actually looking at microplastics, I do FTIR spectrophotometry. So that's Fourier transform infrared spectrophotometry, where you basically match a particle to a database with known wavelengths, and it outputs for you exactly what type of plastic you're looking at. So what I have found in the sediments quite a grim picture. You guys can see here in this graph that it's evident the greatest number of microplastic particles was found at the intertidal zone of the Umanu sewage outfall. There was 2,800.2 particles per square meter. So it is really grim. And why it's accumulated at the intertidal mark is still something that we need to investigate. It can be because the sewage outfall runs 30 meters into the ocean, and maybe with tides, or if we've got any hydrologists or oceanographers online, I would like to have a chat to you guys about that, because we would think that there would be more particles that accumulate on the high tide mark as the tides push them up. But what we found is that on the intertidal mark, there was a greater accumulation. Then we found the least particles at Tuapira Beach on the intertidal mark, and that was 354.44 particles per square meter, which is still very concerning. It is high numbers. But these numbers do align with the Canterbury study, the Auckland study, and with other studies overseas. I will just going to look at what I've done is I've also drawn a comparison between the upper parts of the harbour and then mid and the lower harbour and the open coast. Yeah, we would expect to see those higher numbers on the open coast of what I found at Umanu. But the upper harbour has got quite high numbers, whereas I would think the lower harbour around Waikaria estuary and these areas, because it's more populous, would have more microplastic particles than the northern parts of the harbour. So there can be various reasons why we see that. So non-point source pollution is probably one of them that needs to be investigated. Okay, so here we can see that the greatest proportion of microplastic particles found in the sediment was indeed textile fibers. And again, this aligns with all the other studies that's been conducted thus far in New Zealand and overseas. So only a very small percentage of films, 3% and then 12% fragments, but 85% fibers in the sediment samples. And so the bivalve shellfish sampling and processing is much easier and simpler than the sediment. So we just collected 10 to 15 of each species per location. They were weighed and then the tissue was homogenized with 10% potassium hydroxide. And once it was nicely homogenized, it was filtered onto a membrane, and the same microscopy techniques was employed to see what we found in our bivalves. And the tissue, because the tissue was weighed before homogenization, that allowed me to extrapolate the number of microplastic particles found per gram of tissue. Let's see. A question, we'll get to that after. So what have I found in the bivalves? This is really concerning. So I have actually statistically proved that Macromona liliana does ingest more microplastic particles than Ostrovenus. So it's Macromona in blue and then Ostrovenus in the orange. There wasn't Ostrovenus available at every site either, but where they were available, you can see that there is quite a statistical and a big difference between the number of microplastics found in Macromona as opposed to that in Ostrovenus. Yes, so this is just the amount of microplastics that are found per gram of tissue. And again, we can just see that Macromona's got way more than Ostrovenus at all the locations where they both were samples. Right, so what have I found in both species? I have found fragments to be the predominant type of plastic particle ingested, 92% in Ostrovenus and 70% in Macromona. Did I preferentially eat the fragment? We do not really know. More research is needed. However, a recent unpublished study by Auckland University suggests that Macromona preferentially eats microplastic particles. Yeah, that is really a big concern. And what's interesting is that I found fragments in the bivalves and that I found fibers in the sediment. So more research is needed. So what is the big issue of these small invisible particles? Well, in short, they bioaccumulate in the aquatic food web, and this cartoon is self-explanatory. However, the particles act as toxic rafts and become persistent organic pollutants, POPs, which bioaccumulate in the benthos. And us as humans, we are apex predators and we're on top of the food web, so it does build up in the food chain. So why do I care? There are so many more reasons as to why I care about this issue than what, oops, sorry guys, wrong button. Oops, let me call it back, yeah. Sorry for that. There are so many more reasons as to why I care about this issue than what I have mentioned on the slide. It is a massive issue affecting quality of life for aquatic species and humans. In aquatic species, they inhibit growth, which ultimately then affects reproduction, with several other functionality disruptions. In humans, they act as endocrine blockers and have carcinogenic effects. Once organisms are affected, the whole ecosystem can go out of whack and reach tipping points which cannot be recovered. And then Maori have a strong connection and hold a holistic view to water. Cultural practices such as kaimoana gathering could be severely affected by microplastic pollution. Furthermore, the economic repercussions could be severe for aquaculture ventures. The New Zealand aquaculture strategy is a blueprint to becoming $1 billion sector by 2025. If an aquaculture venture goes up in an area considered to be a microplastic hotspot, and our products are exported, tested overseas, and found to be contaminated, it can cause a massive backlash for New Zealand and can severely impact communities such as the Podokee that have a high ranking on the deprivation index. Thank you for listening. I will hand you guys over to Laura.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hopefully my mic is working and you can hear me. As Sam said, my name is Laura Robichaud. I am a PhD student at the University of Auckland. My supervisors are Sue Bowen, Mark Dixon, who is here watching, and Paul Kench. I am funded by the Living at the Edge project, and my research focuses on evaluation of the implementation gap in coastal risk management. So my thesis, I've been working on it for quite a while, like Sam said, and I am in my 4th year. So I'm going to try and condense about 4 years of work into 20 minutes. So we'll see how that goes. So coastal risks are actively being managed all over the world. Coastal risks meaning how coastal hazards, specifically flooding and erosion, impact communities. Because if they're impacting environments, certainly that's something that we can manage, but it's a bit less in your face, if that makes sense. We do know that these coastal risks are increasing, not only due to climate change and sea level rise and slow onset hazards, but also because of increased urban development at the coast. Risk level is a function of a few different things, and as a result, we can manage these risks different ways. The most common ways for managing coastal hazards are defend, adapt, or retreat, as most of us here know. Cooper and Piley in 2014 created this adaptation resistance spectrum, and I've kind of extended that spectrum to include retreat. While retreat is definitely still altering human activities to mitigate the impacts, it does require a bigger paradigm shift. And the implementation of these projects, particularly those at the adaptation and retreat side of the adaptation resistance spectrum, is difficult. For areas like Ile de Jean Charles in South Louisiana, which I'll talk a little bit about later, where the habitat is so degraded and sea levels are coming up so quickly, it's kind of impossible to continue life there. You've got such a profound amount of risk there that you are required to shift the way you're thinking and kind of work to deliver a set of solutions that change how the world thinks about how we manage these coastal hazards. And so, like I said earlier, there is a really quite large implementation gap in coastal risk management. And this gap isn't consistent across different types of projects. The implementation gap is the gap between us knowing that we need to do something, perhaps even funding working groups to create or design or conceptualize solutions to build resilience, or the gap between those projects and the projects that actually get done. And if we understand this implementation gap better, we can improve the systems, how they interact with each other in order to build resilience and sustainability in the coastal zone long term. And so kind of my big why is to better understand the implementation gap in coastal risk management. Specifically looking at the differences in how projects progress through the project lifecycle prior to implementation, through different types of projects along the adaptation resistance spectrum. And so to do that, I need to understand kind of what we already know about how these projects change over time and how they navigate the process. And once I understand that process, I can try and build a model or a map to depict it. And then I can adapt and test those models or maps based on some data. And then from there, analyze patterns and similarities or distinctions to try and come up with some lessons learned. So whenever I started this work, I thought it was important, or whenever you start any research, it's important to understand what kind of ways people are analyzing these things already. And so there's a lot of talk about the adaptation deficit in climate change, or the implementation gap in coastal risk management in the literature already. However, it's largely case study specific, or they look at like integrated coastal zone management, where you are building and integrating a strategy over time. Some people look using the DPSR, drivers, pressures, indicators, state impact kind of framework for analyzing problems and how we respond to them. But I think that the most coherent way that people have looked at this previously is published in Moser and Eskrum's 2010 paper, where they identify barriers and limits and looks at adaptation to climate change in 3 distinct phases. So understanding the need to adapt, planning, and then managing our outcomes and kind of revising over time. And so from looking at that and looking at stakeholder modeling and stakeholder analysis, I found a few different strategies for building different types of models, including like neural networks and Bayesian belief networks. But I was really drawn to fuzzy cognitive maps. Fuzzy cognitive maps are mixed methods visual models. So you've got one there on your screen by Osimi and Osimi, just to kind of show different influences on wetland socioeconomic ecosystems. And so if we look at wetlands, wetlands can reduce lake pollution, and lake pollution can have a negative effect on income, for example. And so that's a really quick and easy way to visualize a lot of information. And then these visual maps can also be represented as matrices, which are really cool, particularly if you are a mathematician or an engineer and are more comfortable with a like tactile way to deal with data than if you're like a social scientist who might value different things. And so the point of fuzzy cognitive maps is to kind of make your implicit assumptions or mental models explicit, and allow you to show what's happening in your head, I guess, to other people, and begin to model that. And so I adopted fuzzy cognitive maps as kind of my basic theory for how I want to unpack the implementation gap. And to start to build those maps, I conducted a literature review using content analysis, which is basically searching for specific things and quantifying how often they're mentioned and that sort of thing. So I used the literature to identify influencing factors, built a mapping framework from that, populated that map framework with case study data to create project-based maps, and then quantified those maps, calibrated the framework, and have executed some analysis. So the content analysis of my literature basically utilized a big searchable database at the University of Auckland, and I searched terms like coastal risk management, climate change adaptation, things like that. Pulled about 300 technical papers, and also utilized kind of a snowball sampling method whereby I would be reading a paper and then they would reference something interesting that hadn't come up in my search. I would have a look, see if it's relevant, and then incorporate that paper as well. So ultimately, for each phase of the implementation process, which are conceptualization, engagement, and execution, I ended up building these big kind of matrices conducting a content analysis of the literature, whereby I was trying to identify and count influence. Those matrices are huge and unwieldy and not very fun. And so I used some fuzzy cognitive mapping techniques to create visual depictions of these matrices to show conceptualization and the factors that influence it, engagement and the factors that influence that, and execution and the factors that influence that. And now these visual maps are interesting and useful on their own. Myself as an engineer, if I know that I am going into a project and trying to think about how I'm going to execute it once I've got the consent or something, I know that I've got to keep an eye on how much change is this going to provoke and what kind of response am I likely to get from the community because I'm provoking that change. And just kind of monitor those things because they can cause stumbling blocks later on and prevent the project from getting implemented. So the visual maps in themselves are useful, but hidden within each node is something perhaps even more useful. So each node is built in a nodal valuation spectrum, whereby we've got this quantified spectrum from -3 to +3, where positive scores show us progressing the project forward through the implementation process, and negative scores would perhaps make it less likely to proceed to the next phase. And these quantified spectrums are sit alongside qualitative spectrums that kind of tell us something about the state of the node. So singular event versus a process. If it's a single phase, no additional public noticing required, we might sail through kind of thing, at least with respect to that specific node's information. If it's a decade-long process and then we've got a pandemic and we can't start it right away, we could potentially see that project stall and die a slow death or a quick one. And so we've got all of this information built into the visual maps that can be depicted by matrices. And so that means that I can build maps for individual case studies to hold 90 pieces of data throughout the implementation process to hopefully start to understand it a bit better. And so I've selected 16 case studies, half of them in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, half of them in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, which is getting hammered by a couple of hurricanes right now. Actually, the first one wasn't too bad, but that's neither here nor there. So for the case studies that have been selected, there are a range of hard and soft defense, adaptation, and retreat. Adaptation projects actually have had pretty minor uptake in New Zealand, at least on the coast. Adaptation projects, in my mind, I would define them as kind of retrofitting our existing systems to live with hazards a bit better. So that's like elevating houses on stilts and things like that. But those projects are pretty difficult to look at implementation and unpack that because they require so much individual uptake. So project success is very individualized. And so if we look at maybe some of the retreat case studies to see how they fit into the MAP framework to give you an idea of how this all works. Looking at retreat in Homoana, that process started alongside a groin study in 2008. And then Ile de Jean Charles has had several retreat attempts over the past 20 years. The one that I'm talking about here now started in 2016. It's a $48 million effort to retreat the community and completely relocate the community and restore the cultural practices and things like that. So just picking a few nodes and trying to see how that data kind of fits into them. In Homoana and Ile de Jean Charles, we know that they've been retreating or resisting retreat for decades. So from a cultural standpoint, it's kind of a no-go for this kind of project. Scale of project can be a little tricky if we think about it, because on the surface value, Homoana has 21 homes that they're trying to retreat. Ile de Jean Charles has between 20 and 25. So they would, at least surface level, get the same score for that. However, Ile de Jean Charles is retreating the entire village to a new village they're calling the New Isle. And not only that, but anyone who's lived on the island since 2012 is also eligible for a free or subsidized home in that community. And so it becomes a much more arduous process whenever you're building a community from scratch and you're billing it as this kind of cultural restoration project in addition to just retreating. Whereas in Homoana, they're kind of saying, maybe here's some money, it's time for you to go, or they're just saying, it's time to go. And so you've got quite a bit of nuance in how you pull your data and score your data. And some of that is obviously not captured in these 5 words here that I've included, but would be captured in the more in-depth kind of pulling of data to start to quantify these nodes, if that makes sense. There are lots of nodes. These are just a few for our 3 phases. So that kind of gives you an idea of how I started to use the case study data to populate the maps and then quantify the bits of data. And looking at it kind of at a macro scale, obviously the specific numbers there you're not going to see, nor will you be able to see the specific nodes. But in the conceptualization phase, we look at it and we see these 4 first case studies here are all retreat. And they've got very negative scores, but somehow they continue. And they continue largely because the project driver is the government, and the government wants it to continue. So it's going to continue beyond conceptualization. If we look at that black cell there, the black cells are the ones that fail during that phase. So that is a levee system that would protect Ile de Jean Charles that was binned because it didn't meet a cost-benefit ratio. And then another one is a breakwater. So looking at that, the conceptualization phase doesn't necessarily model project progression well, but we can still find some interesting information from looking at it through this lens. Looking at community engagement or stakeholder engagement, this phase performs quite a bit better from a modeling standpoint. Our lowest scores are projects that don't progress beyond the engagement phase, and our higher scores do progress. So the black boxes are the ones that fail. So that's promising and interesting and useful that a model of this sort is able to depict that, at least at this early conceptual stage. Same thing for our final phase, project execution. The lowest score has been terminated in that phase, and the more positive scores progress through. So from a very kind of first pass standpoint, where we average the value of each node, the model works, which is great for me at least. I did a little bit more math with it, looking at the different parent nodes and all of that sort of stuff. And whenever you average across parent nodes, you get a similar sort of performance as we do averaging everything, where the engagement and execution phases perform well, conceptualization not so much. And so reflecting back on it, what kind of patterns that we can identify, engagement and execution are well represented by the maps. But conceptualization seems to have a number of like go, no-go factors where, you know, if you don't have any money to progress the engineering of the project or the conceptualization of the project that's going to die. If the project driver no longer has an appetite to continue, it's going to end. But if you've got, a government organization that's driving the project and says, no, we're seeing this through, at least beyond the concept phase, it's going to continue despite maybe scoring poorly in some other areas. Another kind of pattern identified, council's not popular. And you're often met with a bit of resistance, and perhaps a way to combat this is to have some outside experts that I don't know how it would work if they weren't necessarily funded by council, if council's the one driving the project. But there are ways to kind of have these independent peer reviewers that might be able to offset the mistrust there. Perception can matter more than reality, unfortunately. For example, Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, the project started to relocate this primarily Indian community, Indian being Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw, Native American. And they were kind of leading the project, applying for these federal grants. Once the grant was awarded, the federal government imposed some restrictions that required the state to make sure that it was inclusive to all communities, not just the Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw community. The chief ended up getting upset, withdrawing his support, filing a claim with the UN's Human Rights Commission, and encouraging people on the island to kind of take a step back and refuse to retreat. Then a hurricane happened and put 3 feet of water in people's homes for a week. And suddenly people were on board again, and they've got a decent amount of uptake. The houses are being built now, and it looks like most of the community will shift. And I think if we take those thoughts on perception and then take them a step further and look at not only the consequences of your project, but the consequences of an action, that can drive prioritization, not just within communities, but with project drivers as well. So we see that in the Ile de Jean Charles example, but we also see that like in West Shore, where they've had different iterations of a breakwater and a seawall and that sort of thing that have bounced around quite a bit over the past decade. And basically, if we think about it, the lack of action, the inaction, the cost of it, we're going to see some erosion, but people probably won't lose their homes immediately. And so because of that lack of visceral consequence of inaction, we're seeing pretty low prioritization, and it can't really get off the ground and get funding and get moving. And so while we are able to identify these patterns, because of the limited sample size, it's hard to kind of differentiate the signal from the noise, if that makes sense. And so the way to remedy that would be to collect more case studies and populate the maps. And that is something that's totally doable, but it takes about 2 weeks to populate each map. And I don't have time with the thesis. I need to finish it. And so at this phase is kind of a hint that fuzzy cognitive maps could be a really useful mathematical tool to understand the processes underpinning project implementation, specifically in coastal risk management, but we could expand this beyond it. The maps, I think, are generic enough that it could be expanded. However, we would need to collect more case study data in order to unpack that a bit better. Fuzzy cognitive maps can reliably kind of depict the process. There was very little data that I found about case studies that couldn't be incorporated into the maps. So that was also promising. So yeah, in conclusion, I think that they are a really useful tool. We can begin to unpack things a bit better using this more tactile approach. And there's hope that something like this could be expanded and used in the future, both as a predictive tool, but also maybe for councils trying to troubleshoot their way through projects when they're in the early phases. So yeah, that's me. I am hopefully finishing up the thesis soon and starting full-time work. I'm definitely keen to volunteer and do things in the Bay of Plenty. So if there's any potential to collaborate, say now.
Okay. Hey, thanks, guys. That was really good. Two quite different sort of studies, but I think both important in their own right. We've got a few questions that we're filtering through, and looks like a couple more are coming on now. So, Anita, I've got a few there for you in our little notepad thingy. So maybe you just want to sort of read them out and give us a response, eh?
Sure thing. I'm just going to go back. The first question from, I don't know how you pronounce Shash, is XRD might be one more way to categorize them, especially for particulates. On that note, X-ray power diffraction is primarily used, as far as I know, for phase identification of crystalline material. I'm not too familiar with this technique, but I will definitely be able to look into this methodology. But we always just bounce off previous research that's been done, and everybody always suggests FTIR spectrophotometry is the way to go. But it will be good to investigate this. Yeah, because I think it's for more finely ground and bulk composition is determined with that technique. I will be keen to look more into that. And then Ash has got two questions. Have you considered whether your sample locations are in a depositional environment or erosive environment within the harbour and river stream outlets? Within the harbour, we have not, but one chapter in my master's thesis is about oceanography. So once I've done that, we will be looking into that more when all the other locations have also been sampled. And then were I upstream or downstream of the longshore drift of the sewage outfall? I was on the open coast, so downstream, right where the sewage outfall goes into the ocean. I hope that answers that question. I think that's only those ones. And there's another one. Do I know if the microplastic particles, that's from Peter, if the microplastic particles are contained in the gut or do they permeate into the flesh of the bivalves? We will have to do cellular investigations to determine the answer to that question. So we just homogenize the whole tissue. So either way, if it's being ingested, whether it's in the gut or whether it's in the flesh, it can still be detrimental to human health. But yeah, we still have to determine those impacts. But we will have to go down to cellular level, which is more, I think, for PhD level. So that's an ongoing research project. Anything else? Yeah, I think that's me, Sam.
Okay. And Laura had a question from Hamish Rennie. So, yeah, what do you got for us? Oh, Mike.
Sorry, I paused while I was pulling up some data for Hamish. So I had a look at my manuscript publication dates because I did kind of catalog to try and look at that. I've got a couple of papers as far back as 1969, but I kind of see an uptick in papers that I've pulled starting in like the early 90s. Definitely the recency bias counts and is around, but I think that the specifically looking at like integrated coastal zone management has been really formative to how I've tried to catalog nodes, but also the nodes that I've been cataloging. I think that it really incorporates a multidisciplinary approach. As far as the literature that's been around in the 70s and 80s, that unfortunately is a bit more difficult to catalog online. I did try and go until I reached a saturation point. And I think a limit of the study is certainly that I don't have a representation or a representative sample of that older literature. However, I do think that I've got a representative sample of kind of the thinking in the past 20 years, which I hope is good enough. And then we've got a question about fuzzy cognitive mapping, period of quantified approaches. Yep, not using fuzzy models. So I do specifically think that fuzzy models are particularly useful in looking at all of this. Basically, if you guys don't know what fuzzy logic is, people are either short or tall. So they're 0 or 1, but people also exist in this spectrum between short and tall. And it's often quite useful for us to know how close to tall they are or how close to short they are. And so using fuzzy logic and looking at this and combining the mixed methods approach with a fuzzy system is really useful in helping us understand how strongly something is pushing us one way or pulling us the other. You know, I think that we're seeing now that that machine learning and stuff is really, really useful and really powerful. I haven't used Power BI, but I have used, I've played around with Vensim a little bit for the visual modeling, and I have pulled all of my data into MATLAB and used the classification learner to see if it can produce models that worked, and it does. But I'm a little hesitant about what's the word I'm thinking of pulling the data too far where there really isn't scientific basis that the data can be used as a predictive model. Sam, should I take the next question from Ken, or is there one for Anita?
I think the one for Anita, there's one from Ash, talking about sampling upstream of sewage outputs to compare, I guess, as a control. And then Shazor, yeah, I apologise, I'm not too sure how to pronounce that. Just a comment about the XRD again as well. So maybe you guys want to have a chat about that one offline. It sounds like may know what they're talking about. Yeah, so yeah, maybe answer Ken's question if you can.
So Ken asked, is there support for or opposition to hard seawall defenses such as seawalls? So one thing that I find really interesting, of course, communities love their walls. Down in South Louisiana, we've got a levee board chair that says dirt is better than air. Whenever the water's coming at you, you want dirt, not air. And I can understand why he feels that way and why communities feel that way. Very largely, or by and large, the seawalls are preferred by communities because it is that physical, visual reminder that they're safe. And unfortunately, it can build maladaption. If you've got a seawall, if you've got a big stop bank, if you've got something there, people can be tricked into safety. And seawalls don't remove all the risk. They reduce your residual risk. And if you've got this physical barrier that you think is keeping you safe, you might develop more and invest more and therefore increase your exposure to hazards. We are starting to see kind of some institutional framework shift whereby seawalls are perhaps difficult to get consented, and kind of catching up with consensus in some science that says seawalls are not an appropriate management structure for every area. But I think it's kind of most tricky in that gray area between seawalls and adaptation at retreat. For projects like groins or breakwaters, they're particularly difficult to get consented. Sam knows this. Sam and I have worked trying to consent some groins, particularly with beach nourishment, because of impacts to habitats because of perhaps a larger footprint of the structure or the beach nourishment. So yeah, I think the gap between science, policy, and practice is different for defense, soft defense, retreat. And that different gap between science, policy, and practice does certainly influence the implementation gap. That was kind of all over the place. So yeah, let's see, Hannah. Napier, yep, they've got a resource consent for a breakwater for Whakarire Ave. There's an interesting social situation. It, yep, protects 10 houses on Charles Street. They're doing some modeling and stuff, or not modeling, surveys for cost sharing. Considering construction costs for structures, do you feel the whole community should pay for it, or should it be attributed to those households? So obviously, you know, it's hard. If it were a beach nourishment, or if it was going to stabilize the beach for quite a bit, I think West Shore is one of the few swimming beaches in the Hawke's Bay area. So investing in that amenity might be something that you could push the entire community to pay for. But there's quite a lot of research that basically shows that that if you've got a structure that's only going to protect a select few, the only people willing to pay for it are the select few, and often they're not willing to pay for it either, which I think we're seeing in Napier, because they would be sat with a bill of over $100,000 a piece, and that's probably not worth it for retirees that are only going to be around another 15, 20 years. Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I don't know that I've got a hard answer. I think if I was making the choice, if I was at council, I would probably say that a certain proportion of it has to be, a large proportion of it has to be borne by those that are directly benefiting, and then a proportion of it can cost share with the wider community. But that's just my opinion.
I'm forgetting to turn on the mic. Yeah, it's an interesting debate, Laura. I mean, I know we've had our challenges on the Coromandel where there's been seawalls put in for a private benefit, and then that ends up having some impact on public parts of the beach. So, you know, and it's always, I find it interesting to, when you're trying to put forward, I guess, these softer engineering options, and you're running across more consenting challenges than, you know, perhaps you would if you went down a more traditional path. Couple more questions there. Ken says basically that seawalls do have their place, and I think they do, 100%. So, and Chisora has talked about the Dutch Ocean Cleanup Ring project that might be worth a look at. I imagine that's for Anita, and I'm not sure if you're aware of that one.
I have heard of that before, but yeah, I think there's a lot of mitigation that's needed once we know the whole scope of the problem. It's, for instance, how do we get it out of our sediment? And there is microorganisms in the environment that do eat these microplastics, but it takes them 30 years to break that down. So if we keep on putting pressure on the environment, then they can't keep up with the demand that and anthropogenic pressures that's been placed on the ocean with plastics. So yeah, that's one way of cleaning it up. But yeah, there's a lot of avenues that needs to be investigated, especially at our wastewater treatment plants, where the membranes and the screens still allows those microplastics and nanoplastics to go through, and then it gets discharged back into the environment. But thank you, that's a really awesome suggestion.
Okay, it looks like the questions have been tapering off a bit. So I think we'll wrap it up from there. And again, from the New Zealand Coastal Society, I'd just like to thank both Anita and Laura for stepping up and doing this for us. And yeah, keep up the good work, guys. It's good to see some representation from ladies in the Bay of Plenty. So I think some of the other regions and chats need to step up next. So yeah, right on. Okay.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.